A liberal reporter thought he could humiliate Clint Eastwood with a public takedown. But when the Hollywood legend responded with just a few words, the entire room fell silent. What happened next? The Waldorf Astoria in New York City shimmered under the glow of opulent chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors and mirrored walls. The grand ballroom, a sanctuary of wealth and influence, was alive with the hushed murmurs of Hollywood elites, political power players, and decorated military veterans, all gathered for an exclusive charity gala supporting veterans' mental health initiatives. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided between tables, balancing silver trays adorned with crystal glasses filled to the brim with aged bourbon and fine wine. A soft jazz quartet played in the corner, their melodies weaving seamlessly into the fabric of carefully curated conversations. At the heart of the event stood a towering banner, emblazoned with the evening's mission statement, "Honoring those who served, a night of tribute and commitment." Despite the noble cause, many attendees viewed the gala as an opportunity for networking, self-promotion, and securing lucrative deals behind closed doors. Amidst the chatter of industry gossip, staged laughter, and rehearsed pleasantries, one name rippled through the crowd like an unexpected gust of wind: Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, the legendary actor and director had no entourage, no need for grand introductions, and no interest in the superficiality surrounding him. His presence alone was enough to command attention. As he stepped into the ballroom, his piercing gaze swept across the room, silent yet authoritative. Unbothered by the whispers, he made his way toward the bar, ready for a quiet evening, unaware that a confrontation was brewing in the shadows. Clint Eastwood entered the grand ballroom with a quiet authority that needed no announcement, no flashing cameras, and no entourage trailing behind him. At 94 years old, he had long abandoned the theatrics of Hollywood's social scene, carrying himself with the effortless confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. Dressed in a well-tailored black suit, his silver hair neatly combed back, and his expression as unreadable as ever, he moved with deliberate ease, his steps slow but steady, exuding a presence that made people take notice without quite understanding why. Whispers followed him like shadows, some murmuring about his legacy, others wondering why he had even bothered to attend. Unlike the younger stars, who sought validation in glances and handshakes, Eastwood's presence was not a bid for attention. It was a statement of enduring relevance. Approaching the mahogany-paneled bar, he exchanged firm handshakes with a few longtime friends, including General Robert Bob Reynolds, a 75-year-old decorated Marine veteran who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Their conversation, a mix of old war stories and discussions about the night's cause, was calm, measured, and real. A stark contrast to the artificial exchanges happening elsewhere in the room. As he took a slow sip of his neat bourbon, Eastwood listened more than he spoke, his gaze occasionally sweeping across the ballroom, taking in the crowd with the same observant intensity that had defined him for decades. Unbeknownst to him, on the other side of the room, an ambitious young journalist was watching, planning a confrontation that would soon become the night's defining moment. Ethan Carter, a 32-year-old journalist from the Global Voice, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit as he scanned the opulent ballroom, his sharp eyes locked onto his target, Clint Eastwood. For years, Carter had built his reputation as a fearless, no-nonsense reporter, a so-called champion of progressivism who thrived on exposing outdated public figures. He had dismantled politicians, mocked celebrities, and stirred online outrage with precision, each article carefully designed to go viral. But tonight wasn't just another article. It was his chance to take down a Hollywood legend. He could already picture the headlines. Clint Eastwood stumbles when confronted about his outdated ideals. The thought alone sent a thrill through his veins. Holding his phone discreetly in his palm, already set to record, he took a slow sip of his whiskey, mentally rehearsing the confrontation. He had spent hours crafting the perfect line of attack, One that would make Eastwood look foolish, one that would send social media into a frenzy. He wasn't here to interview, he was here to humiliate. Across the room, the iconic actor sat at the bar, quietly engaged in conversation with a retired Marine general, his demeanor calm, his presence effortless. Carter smirked. Eastwood had no idea what was coming. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and strode confidently through the crowd. The room buzzed around him, unaware that a storm was brewing. In mere moments, he would step into the spotlight, challenge a legend, and claim his place in the modern media battlefield. Or so he thought. Ethan Carter moved swiftly through the crowded ballroom, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor as he closed the distance to the bar, where Clint Eastwood sat, relaxed, sipping a glass of bourbon. The moment had arrived. His heart pounded, not with nerves but with anticipation, with the thrill of the takedown he had been preparing for. He straightened his tie, raised his chin, and spoke loud enough to ensure heads would turn. "Mr. Eastwood, mind if I ask you a few questions?" The surrounding conversation lulled, curious eyes flickering toward the brewing interaction. The old cowboy remained still, lifting his drink to his lips, not even sparing Carter a glance. The young journalist hesitated for half a second, then forced a casual chuckle. "I promise I won't take up much of your time." Slowly, Eastwood turned his head, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. The tension thickened. Carter pressed forward, voice firm, brimming with confidence. "Hollywood has changed," he declared. "Do you think there's still a place for men like you? Men who built their careers on outdated masculinity, old-fashioned values, and let's be honest, an industry that no longer reflects modern audiences?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned in, eager for the exchange. The room seemed to hold its breath. This was it. Carter had set the trap, and now he waited, expecting hesitation, a misstep, a stumble, anything he could exploit. But Clint Eastwood just sat there, calm, cool, completely unshaken. Then, with a slow, deliberate sigh, he finally spoke. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" Ethan Carter felt the sting of Eastwood's words, but quickly masked his irritation with a smirk, determined to push forward with his attack. He wasn't about to let a throwaway remark rattle him, not when he had spent hours crafting his argument, not when cameras were recording, and certainly not when he had a point to prove. He squared his shoulders, leaning in slightly, ensuring his voice carried. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to," he countered, flashing a confident grin. "Hollywood is evolving, and a lot of folks believe that the old ways of thinking, traditional masculinity, conservative values are outdated, even toxic. Do you really think audiences today still want to see men like you in the spotlight?" A murmur rippled through the guests gathered nearby. Some exchanged quiet glances, sensing the loaded nature of Carter's question. Others, sipping their drinks, watched with amusement, knowing full well that Clint Eastwood was not a man easily cornered. For a brief moment, the legendary actor said nothing. He simply took a slow, measured sip of his bourbon, letting the silence stretch, making Carter and everyone else feel the weight of it. Then Eastwood set his glass down, his piercing gaze locking onto Carter's, his expression unreadable. "People," he repeated, his gravelly voice low, steady. "Or just you?" A soft chuckle spread through the small crowd. Carter's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected this. A calm, unshakable wall of confidence that made him feel smaller by the second. The game had begun, but suddenly he wasn't sure he was winning. Ethan Carter's smirk twitched, but he quickly recovered, refusing to let Clint Eastwood dictate the pace of the conversation. He had come too far, and he wasn't about to lose control. "I think the world moves forward with or without you, Mr. Eastwood," he said, injecting a mocking confidence into his tone. And whether you like it or not, Hollywood isn't the same place it was when you started. People today don't want the same old stories. Grizzled tough guys solving their problems with a gun and a glare. The room stirred, guests exchanging glances, sensing the confrontation reaching a boiling point. Some still sipping their bourbon, watched with intrigued amusement, while others, the ones who knew Eastwood, waited, knowing Carter had just walked into deep waters. Eastwood tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing, as if studying Carter like a man deciding whether an opponent was worth his time. Then he let out a slow exhale, shaking his head with a faint, almost disappointed chuckle. You think the world moves forward just because some guy with a blog says so? Laughter rippled through the bystanders, the sharpness of the remark cutting through Carter's feigned composure. He clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around his phone. Eastwood leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make Carter feel the weight of each word. Real progress isn't about erasing the past, kid. It's about learning from it. You don't throw away what built you just because someone tells you to. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress, not whatever the hell this is. The room responded instantly. Low murmurs, knowing nods, and even a few smothered chuckles. Ethan's confidence visibly wavered. He had planned for many responses, but not this one. Ethan Carter felt his control slipping, and panic flared beneath his carefully composed exterior. He had walked into this exchange certain that he would dominate the conversation, but now, standing before a man who had seen and done more than he ever would, he realized his strategy was falling apart. His mind scrambled for something, anything to regain his footing. He straightened his posture, his voice sharper now, more defensive. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," he shot back, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when your generation had it easier. You didn't have to face the challenges we do today. An industry that's harder than ever to break into, a world where people struggle just to be heard." A hush fell over the room. The guests, once amused spectators, now shifted uncomfortably, sensing the desperation in Carter's words. Some shook their heads, others sighed. They had seen this before, a young man mistaking arrogance for wisdom, mistaking volume for truth. Clint Eastwood, however, remained completely unfazed. He let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head as if Carter had just said the dumbest thing he'd heard all night. "Easier?" he repeated, his gravelly voice laced with quiet disbelief. His piercing gaze locked onto Carter's, the weight of nearly a century of experience bearing down on him like a mountain. "Kid, I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their names because they sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever set foot in the studio. I shoveled asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal. You ever done that?" Carter blinked, caught off guard, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. For the first time that night, he had nothing to say. The room was silent now, the weight of Clint Eastwood's words hanging in the air like a slow-burning fire. Ethan Carter stood frozen, his breath shallow, his grip tightening around his phone, as if it could somehow save him from the humiliation unraveling before him. He had come into this encounter expecting to expose Clint Eastwood as a relic of the past, but instead, he had been stripped down to nothing more than an inexperienced provocateur, grasping at straws in front of an audience that was no longer on his side. Across the room, a middle-aged film director smirked, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered to a colleague. He didn't even see it coming. Another guest, barely suppressing laughter, clapped Clint on the shoulder as he passed by. Meanwhile, Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, his face flushed with the heat of a defeat he hadn't anticipated. Without another word, he lowered his phone, cleared his throat, and muttered something incoherent before turning sharply on his heel, disappearing into the crowd. No parting shot, no last word, no grand exit, just a man who had underestimated a legend and paid the price for it. Eastwood, entirely unbothered, took another sip of his bourbon, his gaze already drifting back to General Robert Reynolds, the veteran he had been speaking to before the interruption. Now he said, his voice smooth and unaffected, "You were saying something about Fallujah?" And just like that, the night moved on, except for Ethan Carter, whose lesson in humility would linger long after the lights dimmed. The confrontation had ended, but the lesson remained. It wasn't about politics, generations, or even winning or losing. It was about wisdom versus arrogance, about the difference between talking and truly understanding. Ethan Carter had walked into that ballroom certain he would take down a legend, armed with buzzwords, talking points, and the self-assurance of a man who had never been truly tested. But Clint Eastwood didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise his voice, and certainly didn't need to prove anything. Because true strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from building something that lasts. Eastwood had lived through eras, outlasted trends, and forged a legacy that time itself couldn't erase. Meanwhile, Carter had spent his energy waiting for someone else to fall rather than learning how to stand on his own. In a world obsessed with gotcha moments and performative outrage, Clint Eastwood reminded everyone that substance will always outlast spectacle. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the one with something worth saying. If you respect wisdom, experience, and standing by your principles, hit that subscribe button. Because some voices don't fade with time, they only get stronger.